I very often start a presentation or a discussion with this picture. What you see here, that was the first day in Paris, and those are more than 180 leaders of our world coming together saying, we want this agreement. We don't know the details yet, but we want this agreement. We want to go in this one direction. And I think this kind of commitment already shows that this is beyond just preparing a report or preparing signing something. It actually shows a political direction that is required, where we need to go, and that we need to take this very seriously. And the key element of the Paris Agreement, I think in that case, are really the NDCs. And the NDCs is something new compared to before. Let me show you here where they are. They are a target a country puts forward, and it is their own target. It is nationally determined. I think that is critical to always keep in mind. It is something each country assesses for themselves, what is possible in our country and what can we do to achieve that, and can we achieve that. But once you put forward this target, you actually also have to live up to it. And as you mentioned already, there's a whole process around. But first, you also mentioned that earlier, the Paris Agreement has actually several levels. So there is a collective goal, that is the 1.5 or 2 degree target that we all aim for collectively. There's then the collective effort, and that is something that's happening once you start implementing your NDCs and also your NAPs. That is where we as a global society, as a global community, are moving the global emission trajectory down to where it needs to be. So in order to be in line with the collective goals. And then comes what is most important for every country, that is the individual effort, and that is a successive NDC. And there you see that the word successive already indicates we need to have more than one goal. And that is because the collective goal, and we're currently, we just published on Friday a synthesis report of all the NDCs, where we are saying that, or showing that the NDCs, the effort that parties want to put in place between now and 2030, that is not enough for us to reach either the collective goal or the global trajectory of where we need to go. So that means this is a process over time. We need to get there over time. And all that will be supported by a transparency framework. That is, these are arrangements that will have each country report and track on the NDC and the progress they're making. And then we come together and take stock of where we are. So that is in general the whole idea of the Paris Agreement. When you zoom a little bit in here, you see that NDCs will come every 5 years. And every 5 years, an NDC also has to be better than the last one. And here I think we already start looking at a process, because when you are preparing your NDC right now, it is not a one-off. You already need to have in mind, and where could the next one start, and how could we then move into the next one? And that is very important for everyone to understand and to have this shift in mindset now coming forward, because it actually tells you this is not a one-off. We are doing that every 5 years, and every 5 years has to be better than the last one. So that means, and here comes the first link of this whole NDC cycle to a planning cycle. Where do we want to be, not only in 5 years, but in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and what we see now increasingly 2050 as like a long-term target for decarbonization, or mid-century. So, as I said, we are now moving on this kind of spiral towards more ambition over time, and everyone has to implement that at their own pace with their own capacities. And every 5 years, we are taking stock, what is called the global stock take. That is when all governments again come together and they look at the collective progress vis-a-vis our collective goals. And after the global stock take, there will be a decision, very likely, inviting all countries or urging all countries to enhance their ambition, because we are not where we need to be. So let me try to put that all now into one big cycle. As you mentioned, these elements are on its own in under the Paris Agreement, not standalone items. You highlighted already that there is a whole planning cycle, there is a budget cycle, there's a finance cycle. It is now up to the countries to integrate these cycles so that it becomes like an integrated approach towards planning with a strong climate component that then also responds to the Paris Agreement. And what you see here, let's start off from the NDCs. That is where we are right now. Governments have been preparing the NDCs, they communicate them to us, and then here it is only like a small box called implementation. That is small on this cycle, but it is actually the main element of all this work. This is the heavy lifting that each government has to do. That is where you come in. That is where EU for Climate comes in, UNDP, all the support infrastructure that is out there to help do the implementation. However, whatever we are implementing also needs to be accounted for and needs to be tracked. And that is very, very important. And Andreas mentioned earlier, and Sarah as well, one of the problems we are facing is that we don't have the climate information to actually inform the NDC preparation and to inform the decision making. So the Paris Agreement itself takes care of it by implementing this enhanced transparency framework. And again, here it's now very important to see that this is not a one-off. Like climate reports as of 2024 have to be prepared every 2 years with a continuous tracking of your NDC. So that means the moment you start implementing your NDC is also the moment you actually need to start the tracking process. And that itself will create a lot of data and information that can be used for many other planning processes as well. And I think that is very important to keep in mind, that the tracking and the reporting on the NDC, the climate reporting, including on adaptation, is not, first of all, to fulfill the obligations under the Paris Agreement, but is actually to have a tool and have a process that allows each country to first of all get, manage, and develop climate information, which will be later used for decision making, which will be certainly can also be very, very useful for the GCF and other processes that are related. After the accounting comes the reporting. Each report by every country will undergo a review and also a consideration process where governments can talk to each other, can ask questions about that. Where are you actually vis-a-vis your NDC implementation? And there you realize this is not just submitting something somewhere to the EU. It is actually something you have to live up to. You have to defend. You have to be very well aware of what is happening in my country with my NDC, because you have to defend it or explain it to other countries. All this information then again goes into the global stocktake, as I mentioned. That is where we take stock of where we are collectively. And after the global stocktake, this cycle starts over again. So the global stocktake is every 5 years. 2023 will be the first one, 28 and so on. And the global stocktake will inform the preparation of your next NDC. What I mentioned earlier, we are currently very far off from reaching the global objectives. Therefore, it's very likely that the first global stocktake will come to the assessment that we need to do more. Please prepare new and more ambitious NDCs. And that is now something for every country to already keep in mind when starting working with that this is a continuous process that will run at least until we reach the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And it has several stages, and very important one is the reporting and the tracking and gathering all this information. Here I put down how this actually looks like in what needs to be reported. I think that is a detail. I leave it in the slides, but it's not that important for what we're doing. But in general, reporting needs to be done on the GG inventory, tracking of progress of your NDC. Which support have you received as a developing country, and which support are you providing as a developed country? And then also, that is not mandatory, but everyone should report also on adaptation. And this information is, I think, very, very critical for everyone to move on to start the planning of the next NDC and also of long-term strategies. So I put out the cycle. We are actually currently on the left-hand side, that is the synthesis report. We just published it. We are now moving into the COP, and then the implementation period of the NDCs will start. 2023, we have the first global stocktake. 2024, the first report. 2025, next NDCs are due. Then 2026, the next report is due 2027, and so on. So it just continues. You actually see this kind of coming over and over again, and it will create a continuous process for, on one hand, climate planning, ambition setting, but also on the other hand, reporting. And ultimately, it is also what you mentioned, Kavita, what is critical is that this kind of, understanding that there is a process, it's not a one-off, it's not a project-based approach anymore, needs to also be ultimately reflected in the institutions within each country, so that this information can be provided, and then ideally also the institutions work together in a way that this information can be provided, for example, to you and others in a way that works, again, for the GCF cycle. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions, and of course also via email.
On this slide, you can see the adaptation provisions, which are in Article 7 of the Paris Agreement. And Article 7 basically defines a global goal for adaptation. It outlines adaptation as a global challenge. It emphasizes the importance of recognition of adaptation efforts, and also the link between mitigation ambition and adaptation needs. There are certain principles outlined for adaptation, and the importance of support and cooperation is highlighted. Article 7.9 is where planning and implementation come in, and this is actually an obligation for all countries under the Paris Agreement, is to plan and implement adaptation efforts. However, how countries do that and what instrument they use for that is voluntary. But the main arrangement for this is the process to formulate and implement NAPs, which I think has already been discussed quite a bit in these conversations. Article 7.10 to 7.12 define the arrangement called the adaptation communication. And these are for communicating adaptation information with the aim of enhancing the visibility of adaptation and its profile, to improve adaptation efforts, support and learning, and also to inform the global stocktake that Bernd already spoke about. Then Article 7.13 mentions in very general terms how adaptation should be supported internationally, and then Article 7.14 talks about how the global stocktake should consider adaptation. And then also Article 13.8 outlines that parties should report on adaptation in their biennial transparency reports. So coming to the details about the arrangements for adaptation information. These are basically the arrangements that are in place, and there are 3 different types here. First one are the national communications, which have already for about 20 years now been a vehicle for detailed information on vulnerabilities and adaptation, among other things. The second category are the Paris Agreement arrangements that were added in 2015. These are the adaptation communication, the BTRs, and the national and NDCs. And the additional thing here is that these basically introduce new purposes and types of information that aim to respond to the needs of the Paris Agreement, in particular with the purpose of informing the GST. And then the third aspect is that reporting on adaptation is also part of some of the planning and implementation processes for adaptation, in particular the NAPs. So this is quite a bit of arrangement, and this is quite different from what you saw from mitigation, where you have a fairly clearly articulated arrangements in the NDCs and the BTRs. But the reason for this multiplicity is flexibility. So countries basically have near full flexibilities about where to report and what to report on adaptation. And one important dimension is also to reduce the reporting burdens from this system. But the challenge that comes with the flexibility is that each country needs to think through for itself what combination of arrangement actually works best. for their national situation. So coming to slide 4, on this slide you can see the main guidelines and timeframes for these main reporting instruments, namely the national communications, adaptation communications, and BTRs. I'm not going to go into any of the details. You can see this as a reference later in the slides, but there's a couple of things that are worth mentioning. One is that the adaptation communication has a special function in this area because it can be submitted as a component of other documents or together with other documents. It can be part of a NAP, a national communication, an NDC, or a BTR. We call these vehicle documents. And the information in the adaptation communication can be adapted to the guidelines of the vehicle document. The other specialty about the adaptation communication is that it provides the framework also for adaptation components of NDCs. If you look at what guidelines are available, we have guidelines for national communications, we have guidelines for NAPs and biennial transparency reports. And then the adaptation communication guidance provides the information that is needed when you include an adaptation component in your NDCs. But again, this is a voluntary thing. You don't have to use that guidance for the NDC component, adaptation component, but there is some guidance available through the adaptation communications process. Another feature here that you can see is that the BTRs can basically, in terms of adaptation, they can reference already submitted documents. And the aim here is to just update information rather than kind of have to prepare a complex set of new information. One thing to highlight here is also that these arrangements are being worked on and refined as we go along. So, for example, the guidelines for the national communications are going under revisions. The adaptation committee is developing supplementary guidance for the adaptation communications, and the substa is discussing the outlines for the biennial transparency reports. Just to mention quickly, to show you the different types of information that should be included in reporting and adaptation in these various documents. And you can see various overlaps here, and the reason is again that this provides the flexibility to countries to include things to use the document that they prefer. Here, perhaps the one dimension is that the Paris Agreement arrangement, especially the adaptation communication and the BTRs, they add certain new types of information. These similarities in information, this further emphasize the need to basically, for each party, consider what combination of instruments works best for their national situation. So that's the information and reporting arrangements. And now moving towards the NAPs, and also to talk a bit more about the kind of continuous use of these instruments within the cycle. I'll just say a very quick word about the NAPs. This is probably already out of date. I'm sure it's out of date in terms of the finance side, but at the end of last year, about 125 countries indicated that they have taken some steps to formulate their NAPs. And the new and updated NDCs we received this year also illustrates this trend. There was about 80 countries that described what they're doing in their NAPs. And that shows how NAPs are basically provide the global template for planning and implementation of adaptation. And I think this pattern that you can see in the NDCs, where countries talk about what they're doing on the NAPs, that illustrates quite nicely the sort of continuous use for these instruments, where you have the NAP as a sort of engine of national level planning, and then you have the NDCs used as a kind of a visibility instrument where countries provide an overview of what they're doing at the national level, basically. And to kind of elaborate a bit more on that point, I have here added my understanding of the cycle. I think Bernd's cycle, it looked much better than mine, but this is the sort of adaptation version of it. The point I would like to discuss with this slide is about how you kind of organize this multiplicity of adaptation arrangements within the cycle in a way that it provides kind of a continuous process. because on the one hand, we have many reporting options that are mostly voluntary, and then we have the NAPs as the planning and implementation instruments. So the question of coherent use and continuous use relates in particular to the reporting arrangements. And one thing that's really important to emphasize is that the UNFCCC decisions do not dictate at all how countries should combine these instruments. That's very essential. It's here on this slide is basically a suggestion of how one can approach this question and align with the cycle of the Paris Agreement. So the idea here is basically that the NAP provides the place to define your adaptation plans and efforts and projects. And then based on the NAP, one can basically, based on the information generated in the NAP process, it's possible to prepare an adaptation communication that basically highlights the efforts that are envisaged under the NAP. And this would be, for example, a forward-looking overview of the adaptation goals, of the support needs for those actions, etc. And then later, when implementation is progressing, countries can report on the implementation of the NAP in their biennial transparency reports every 2 years. And then based on all these sources, the global stocktake can basically undertake its stocktaking function, provide recommendations on how to enhance adaptation. And then when countries are in the process of revising or updating their NAPs, they can consider those recommendations. So that's the sort of, that's how you can basically see this as a continuum around the cycle of the Paris Agreement. I'm going to wrap up there. I'm happy to take any questions, and I hope that was useful and interesting. Yeah. Over to you, Kavita. Thank you.